Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story. It's March the 19th, day 78. And we're going to look at Deuteronomy 24, which is part of your reading. As we were winding down Leviticus reading, people were like, man, I'm so glad we're through with Leviticus. And I said, you still have Numbers and Deuteronomy to come. It might get better after that. You start getting some stories after Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. Most of these are just commands. This is laws. This is how you live. And so this chapter has a lot of commands mostly about relationships. It's mostly how we're to treat people. That's the context. But let me read the first. The first one's kind of odd. Yes. But I want to talk about it. Maybe we can get something out of it. It says, suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. Having discovered something wrong with her, I don't know what he discovers. Yeah. He writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man. But if the second husband also turns against her, writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away, or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. That would be detestable to the Lord. So, one, there's multiple things here that stick out to me. Apparently, he could divorce her by writing her a letter.
Yeah, and just send her on the way.
Yeah, I'm done.
Here's your mail.
She didn't please him, so in what way, I don't know, It says, having discovered something wrong with her. Well, what did he discover that he didn't know? All of those things. She leaves. She can remarry. She's free to remarry if she's divorced. But if she's kicked out again, or he dies, he can't change his mind and go back and remarry. Why? This is. This is. It really is. It's weird, and people have to be reading this thinking this is strange. Yeah. Because honestly, I have counseled with people who divorced, and then later I would remarry them together. They never married again. But I have known couples who divorced, married other spouses, divorced them, and then remarried. And I even am aware of a church that teaches that if you have been divorced and remarried, you are to divorce those spouses. An entire denomination, it's not just a single church. You to be right with God, you have to divorce your second spouse and remarry your original spouse, so that you're married 3 times instead of twice. Yeah. I don't know.
It kind of cancels each other out.
Right. Says that. Well, they say you're only anyway. It's complicated. Yeah. But I don't know whether you married again and said, well, maybe she's not so bad after all, or maybe, and this works both ways. Right. I mean, this is a single way illustration, but it works both ways. Maybe he's not so bad after all, but we have a tendency to forget how difficult things were, or complicated things were. Why is it that we forget and want to go back to something that caused us pain?
It sure is our natural tendency. It can be in a relationship you're in. It can be a political figure. It could be a pastor at a church that you've got a lot of history, been through a lot of difficult times, and all of a sudden they announce, okay, this is my last Sunday, and all of a sudden he becomes a hero of the world. Mm-hmm. And you're like, have you forgotten all that you've been through? But it is our natural tendency.
Yeah, my dad used to say, the most loved pastor is the one that's been gone for 24 months. Yeah. And then people have forgotten. Yeah, they got a new one that they don't, they can grab about.
That's right.
And they forgot all the bad things they had to deal with.
And I think that is part of the insight to this passage, that by the second wife relationship, it's like, you know what? Some of the things I thought were big deals weren't that big. And I think the overall, at least for me, that thing we can extract from this is that we shouldn't be frivolous in the relationships.
Sure.
That it has to be more than emotions, feelings. There has to be decisions going into it, that this is a lifetime commitment. And because if you just think, well, I can come and go, I can get in and out of a relationship anytime I want to, that's never a good thing.
Yeah, I think I can't speak from experience with multiple wives, but I can't speak from experience with jobs
Feels better
as an
now.
example. Yeah. But I can speak from experience with like jobs, and that sometimes you can look back at a job and say like, "Wow, that wasn't so bad," or you only remember the good things that happened, but then sometimes it takes someone reminding you, "Well, don't you remember this, all these bad things that happened, or how they treated you?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, I guess you're right." Sometimes we do look back and we only think of the good things that happened, or even with this case, maybe it was a case of he was married first. It wasn't what he expected, but then he got remarried or someone gets remarried and realizes maybe those things that happened in my first marriage are just normal things that happen in marriage, and you don't really realize that until you have something to compare to, and so that could happen.
Yeah, I think our memory is much more faulty than we want to believe.
Yes.
And, we think we're smarter, wiser. I do think it lends itself, as Jay said, for us to understand the importance of the relationship. I think the other thing, whether it's a woman or a man, if something happens multiple times to you, you need to do some self-reflection.
Yeah, what's the common
That's
denominator?
right.
That question needs to be asked.
Yeah. So then it says, a newly married man must not be drafted in the army or be given any other official responsibilities. He must be free to spend 1 year at home, bringing happiness to the wife he has married. Why is it important for couples to have time to establish a marriage relationship?
There's so many things to work through. Obviously, the longer you date, the more you discover about people. But there's some things you just don't discover and realize until you said "I do,"
Right.
and then you're living together each and every day. And some of those things may be pleasant surprises, some of them not so pleasant surprises. But I think this is extremely important that this couple was able to give themselves to each other completely, physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually, to discover who each other is and to make a foundational commitment that would last a lifetime. It would be nice if we had the opportunity and ability to do that in our culture today. Honeymoons now last a few days, maybe a week, maybe two at best. And
Yeah, and a lot of times you may have a child early.
Mhm.
You may get married because it's a second marriage and there are already children. Or there's so many things that
that's right.
change.
Yeah, and there's some things you just want to know and you want to prepare. I mean, you can like actively prepare for as you are first in marriage. Like for instance, you wouldn't want to get married and find out a year later they snore. Like you find that out typically when you first get married, and so you can like, oh, I can buy earplugs or
Sleep
you can
number
sleep.
bed.
Yeah, or yeah, so sleep number beds can stop snoring. What?
So I've heard. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'm not buying it. Well, I'm the one
I
who
thought
snores.
I heard
Let
him
me just
say
say-
sleep in another bed. I didn't hear
Sleep.
Sleep.
Number.
I think it's sleep number bed. Maybe the sleep number beds just go wee. They just split up like I Love Lucy. It's just like wee, just becomes two separate beds. But there are things that you learn early on in marriage, and it's being together helps really establish a relationship in a lot of different ways. And so if you wait to do that for a long time after you've made that covenant, after you are married, I think it could impact some things. You want to be in there and really establish that relationship early on.
And marriage is a life change,
Mm.
and every life change brings challenges. We hired a young man here, I don't know, 7 years ago, and I remember in the interview having the conversation. He had met a girl like 3 or 4 months prior. They had gotten engaged the month prior. We decided to hire him, so they decided to get married 2 weeks before he moved so that she could come with him. So he got married, he moved, bought a house, and started a brand new job all in a period of about 30 days. And all of us were like, we're scared this is just going to wipe him out. And it didn't. He didn't wipe him out. But it had some challenges with it. And I think we don't realize how every life change brings certain challenges and what it's going to throw at us. So there's so many things I wanted to talk about in this passage. So one, it talks about loaning people who are poor money, helping people who are poor. A few months back, I guess last year, we preached a series on finances, and I talked about debt, and one of the things I said is that poor people use debt to survive, middle class people use debt to survive, to spend, and wealthy people use debt to thrive. They use it as an investment opportunity side. So they all look at it completely different. But here he talks about how we're to lend money when it comes to loan and assistance. Tell me our responsibilities when it comes to lending and poor people today. Should we be in the business of lending to poor people? Should it only be gifts? What are some of the challenges of both?
I think we should be willing to help people, I mean, even poor people, even to lend them, but not necessarily with the expectation that you're going to get it back. That's kind of how I've lived my life, is that whenever even with my friends, if they ask to borrow some money, I always give it to them without the expectation of getting it back, even if they know it's being lent to them. Because then I'm not carrying it thinking, oh man, they haven't paid me back. And they also, if they're worrying too, I just let them know, no, it's okay, like I forgive you. I've lost a decent amount of money that way, but sometimes I think it's just right for us to help people, even if we know they're not necessarily going to be able to help us in return, or even just pay back what we've given them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there are opportunities for us, and as a church, but I want to draw it down to an individual level.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's more what this is dealing with.
That there are opportunities that are presented to me from time to time when I see a need and my heart is touched, and I feel like I need to respond to help an individual. And there are zero strings attached to that. It is straight up a gift, and you want to be a blessing and encouragement to those people. And for me, that is pretty clearly defined. It gets complicated when loans come into play here, and the Bible has a lot to say about that. In fact, he says, don't sign for other people, which would be a form of lending to somebody. He says it's not wise, because you're assuming the responsibility. If they had the ability to repay, they wouldn't need you to co-sign for them to start with. I don't think it's wise to lend to family, for instance. I try to steer clear of money issues with family. Gifts are much easier to deal with than they are lending, because if somebody owes you something and there's a problem paying it back, it creates tension and complicates the relationship. It may be to the point where you just avoid people altogether, or they avoid you. And so it can get tricky. I think one of the overarching themes of this is simply not to take advantage of people. Sometimes, loan sharks would come to mind in that, where people are in desperate situations and say, yeah, I'll help you out, I'll loan you money. It's at 40% interest.
The most needy in our world are the ones that pay the most
interest
for the money.
Sure.
Yeah. The poor, the people who have limited income, because it's higher risk. That's how the bank sees it.
That's right.
It's the people who are using pawn shops,
right,
who are paying 25% a month, not a year, 25% a month, fees to on their stuff, or payday lenders where they're living week to week, and they're giving 10% of their paycheck, or whatever to get an advance on their paycheck. That is predatory. That is opposite of what we read here.
Yeah, I think that those are easy to see.
Yeah. And I think us as a church have to be. Let's not say that. Us as Christians should be vocal about how abusive some of those things are, and I have seen organizations, nonprofit organizations, and it's a shame that it has to work this way, that seek to lend money to disenfranchised or poor or people who are trying to start over, people who are just getting out of jail at lower interest rates because they can't go to the bank and get it. And it's a real tension in society, because when it comes to lending, there's a tension present in Scripture. There are multiple proverbs that warn us about the dangers of debt. But in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, lending to the poor is a favored thing from God. Jesus would commend it. God would commend it in the Old Testament, that lending to the poor is a positive thing. And I think, but it's also a complicated thing.
It is.
Being able to lend without expecting anything returned is nearly impossible to do. I don't want to say, Zack seems to think he can do it. It was Jay and Zack all in one sentence. He seems to be good at it. For me, what I've had to do is say, it's a gift, and say on the front side, it's a gift. So it takes the obligation.
Yeah, so in reality, in the examples you were using, I mean, if somebody, the only access to money they got is at 30%, but you're willing to do it 5%, I mean, that seems like a huge blessing to them. The problem comes in when they no longer have the ability to repay, right. and how you respond and deal with that is where the challenge comes in. And I would just say, that as a church, one of the things that we do to try to help people is to manage, not just manage debt, but to eliminate debt, how to handle finances, because I truly think that is a much better approach when you teach people how to move forward from this point on, rather than just how can I help you get out of this crisis at the moment.
Right. So, and there are a couple other things it says you have to treat foreigners just like you do your own. There shouldn't be different laws that apply to them. Parents shouldn't be put to death for the sins of their children. Children shouldn't be put to death for the sins of their parents, even though we see this a couple of times in the New Testament. When we get to Joshua, we're going to see Achan and his entire clan be put to death because of his sin. How to lend to the poor, who you can marry, who you can't marry, the challenges of those. Should we try to take any of these and make application to them today?
The simple answer is yes, because they all, even though they address different aspects, it all boils down to the motivation of the heart, how we feel about people, how much we're willing to help, reach out to them, and it truly is a matter of the heart. So the principles, they may look different in our culture today, but the motivation of the heart remains the same, whether or not we want to genuinely help people or not.
Yeah, and so in verse 18 it says, "Always remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from slavery. That is why I have given you these commands." And as it talks about this, I think as we're going through the one single story, I think all of this is a reminder that, even though sometimes we think we might be in a better place than people, we might tend to look down on people who don't have the same lifestyle as us, or don't have the same financial situation that we're in. It's important to realize that we all sin, we all fall short, none of us deserve what we have. Everything that we have is a gift, and that we're supposed to use those gifts, just like it says in this, that we're supposed to use those gifts and apply these things to our lives because of what Christ has done for us, what God did for them, and what God has done for us through His Son.
Right. So recently, today and yesterday, as we're recording this, I was listening to a podcast that struck me, and it reinforced some of the things that I'd been reading. And it was not a religious podcast. I'm not even sure the guy was saved, but they asked him the question is, what distinguishes a country that is prosperous and one that is not? And he said the two things worldwide, historically, that you could always count on for all through history that created prosperity were that there was a rule of law and property rights. People owned their stuff and they had a right to it. It didn't belong to somebody else and no one could come and take it. And then the rule of law. The law may not look the same, but everybody got treated the same. And if you went to court, you knew it was going to be fair. If the police came, you knew it was going to...
standard.
That's right, there was a standard. He said in countries that have a rule of law and they have property rights, they are always more prosperous than countries that aren't. He said you can go to countries that only have one of those two things settled, and things will look... It'll get muddy. They're not as prosperous as they look. There'll be really high highs and really low lows. He said, but in the countries that are prosperous, all over the country, he said there's a rule of law and there are property rights. And we've been reading that. God's laying out a rule of law. This is how it's applied to everybody. These are your property rights. This is your land. You're going to get it. It's one of the reasons why they prosper. It seems to be clear that that's the case. I just thought it was interesting. I appreciate that. So, Jay, would you like to close us in prayer today?
Sure. Lord, we thank you for taking the time in your word to demonstrate to us that you care about every individual and that we are to care about other people as well, regardless of anyone's social status. They have an opportunity to have a relationship with you, and you love and care for them. We thank you for that. Help us all to have a heart that's motivated to love other people and to demonstrate that in practical ways when we see the needs and are given the opportunity. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.